Good morning. Thank you, Richard, for the great introduction and great introductory remarks. And thank you to Senator Hawley and Senator Murphy for joining us here today. We're going to kick off the day and the discussion, as Richard said, digging into a lot of the hard questions that he mentioned and seeing if we've got some bipartisan solutions that might be in the offing for any of them. I'm going to start the conversation up here, then move to the audience for Q&A, but we have three quite fancy ways of asking questions to the two senators today, so please pay attention. I'll remind you later on. So first, you can tweet questions at hashtag CNAS 2019, and those will magically make their way up to me. Second, you can open the conference app, select this session, and submit a question that way. And if you are more of a low-tech individual, which is fine, we embrace that as well, there are CNAS staff wandering around the audience who have note cards. They're happy to help you jot those down, and those will also magically make their ways up to me for your wonderful questions. So to start, I actually want to question the premise of this conversation a little bit and talk about what actually is Congress's role in national security, because if you read the Constitution, just a really simplistic read, you see Congress is supposed to play a role in authorization of use of force, in regulating commerce, standing up armies, overseeing the Navy, all of its appropriations authorities. But I think not a week goes by when you don't see an op-ed or an academic study or somebody on TV like me who says Congress has given up all of its power to the executive branch and we are in a crisis and something has got to be done. So I've got to ask you, Senator Hawley, you are a constitutional lawyer. You showed up in Washington in January of this year. What surprised you? You're on the Armed Services Committee and the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. What surprised you about how Congress oversees foreign policy, and what do you think needs to be done to change that?
Well, I think there is a sense in which Congress's oversight and participation in the foreign policy debates are episodic at best, and this is part of a long-term trend that I think we should be worried about that gets to Congress actually just doing its job. I worry a lot about whether Congress is doing its job across the range of responsibilities, whether that's foreign policy or whether it's the budget, for instance. I think in many ways we are at a uniquely dysfunctional moment. This is a happy way to start this conference, isn't it? We're at a uniquely dysfunctional moment.
It'll get better.
In the history of the institution, and I think that's something that should concern us. But can I also just say that as somebody who's new to Washington, but fresh from Missouri, where I'm from, and from spending a lot of time with voters, I think we should also be concerned about what I really think is the failure of the foreign policy consensus of the last 25 or even 30 years. We call it the post-war consensus, the post-Cold War consensus, which I think voters have now pretty decisively rejected. And it really is, I think, a form that consensus was grouped around or organized around what you might call a liberal universalism, the idea that the end of history has arrived, and that end of history will either look like the United States blending in with the rest of the world, the nation state gradually giving way to an international order of rules and international governmental associations, or it will look like the United States making the rest of the world more like us through nation building, or even, to use the dreaded I word, imperialism. Both ends of that spectrum, which are pursued by different parts of our political traditions, both ends of that spectrum turn on a form, I think, of liberal universalism. And I think what we're seeing is, in fact, history has not ended, that liberal universalist dream is not rooted in reality, and maybe more to the point, most to the point, it's been rejected by the American people, who say that we don't want to blend in with the rest of the world, nor do we want to make the rest of the world look like America. We want to see to our interests and protect our needs, and we've got to do that in a way that is sustainable. I think the American people will actually buy into, and I think that's the great challenge of the 21st century.
So Senator Murphy, you have been a strong advocate for Congress, and particularly members of your own party, providing those kinds of alternatives and giving the American people something different to think about in terms of our own potential in foreign policy. And you've also been a major advocate for stronger oversight of national security activities in all of your time in Congress. So I've got two questions for you, but I'll start with the first one because I think that I can probably take the answer. What has made it so hard for Congress to actually perform that role? You have done it admirably over all of your tenure, but a lot of other members of the Senate in particular, but also the members of Congress overall, they don't play a big role in foreign policy, and I think there's a discomfort in debating a lot of these choices.
Yeah, I think you're right, and let me thank CNAS for having both of us here today. Looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, let me pinpoint, I think, two obstacles to Congress playing a more important, influential role in the conduct of foreign affairs. The first is that declaring war simply isn't as easy as it used to be, right?
Yep.
Wars used to be armies marching against each other across broad open fields. They were wrapped up after 3 or 4 years with peace treaties in which both sides retreated back to their places. That's not how conflict works any longer. Enemies are increasingly impossible to define. The conflict has no end. And so when you're asking Congress to declare war, we punt very often because we're not exactly sure how to define that concept any longer. And the result is that decisions are increasingly being made inside the administration, and there is little debate in Congress and little real conversation back with our public about it, because the proper forum for that conversation is in Congress. Second, there's less information before Congress than ever before. What you have seen over the course of the last 20 years is this transition of diplomacy from the State Department to the Department of Defense, and a transition of military activity from the Department of Defense to the covert agencies. And so when you have increasingly important activities with major political consequences happening overseas inside the CIA or NSA that are only seen by a handful of senators, it makes it very hard for us to do our due diligence. So when we were asked a few years ago to create an authorization for the training and equipping of so-called moderate rebels inside Syria, well, we had already been doing that secretly. And the people who were being asked to create an authorization couldn't get any information about what had worked and what hadn't worked. And so it became hard for us to try to make an educated decision. So those are not excuses, because we can correct for both of those, but I think they're explanations.
On that point, though, of how they're not excuses, I get the sense that something has actually changed a bit this year. You see in the Yemen war powers debate that you played a prominent role in, a lot of other congressional activity in foreign policy this year. So am I wrong? Am I just hopeful? Did something change in the last year that has several new members and also some are longstanding members wanting to become more active in this? Or did we just head on a series of issues where the time had come?
I think it's probably the latter. I think in Yemen, it was just increasingly impossible for members on both sides of the aisle to defend a policy that was leading to a unmistakable humanitarian crisis and empowering groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Also increasingly difficult to justify a blank check relationship with an ally who had gone off the rails. Importantly, none of these oversight efforts have come to fruition. We have only been able to pass a war powers resolution because we found a way to do it with 50 votes rather than 60 votes. Ultimately, there wasn't enough to override a veto. And so you're talking about, fairly narrow majorities right now that are made up of the minority party and a small handful of members of the majority party. That doesn't, to me, suggest a paradigm shift.
So I want to talk about the new hotness in Washington these days, great power competition. So the national security strategy and the national defense strategy both elevate great power competition as the priority, the big focus that we should be having in the national security world these days. So I want to ask if that's your view, but I also want to get to a question that Richard touched on in his remarks, which is when we put out these strategies, people like the fact that we prioritize, particularly the national security establishment. They think that's great and useful. The rest of the world doesn't care if we prioritize or not. Iran made pretty clear this week that it's nice that we think that China and Russia are our biggest priorities, but they're still going to ask us to have a lot of time and attention devoted to them as well. So first of all, do you agree with the prioritization these strategies made? And is it even possible to actually prioritize those in practice? Can we take our attention away from the crises that have demanded our focus for the last couple of decades? Senator Hawley?
Yeah, I do agree with these priorities. I think that the NSS and the NDS were very, very important documents and very important for strategic reorientation as we think about the challenges of the 21st century. And I think the return of great power competition is something that is very real, and it is going to, particularly as it relates to China, it is going to be the focus of our foreign policy, needs to be for decades to come. Can we prioritize? I mean, my view is we had better learn to prioritize because it's simply, let me just go back to a point I made a second ago. The American people simply will not support the continuing do-it-all strategy. They're not going to support these endless wars in the Middle East. They're just not. I mean, the American people, they look at what we're doing in Afghanistan, they look at what we're doing in Syria, and they say, why are we there again exactly? I mean, what is it that we're doing? I mean, I've talked to people, to fathers who deployed to Afghanistan 18 years ago, and now their sons or daughters are in Afghanistan. That is, in the communities where I come from, that is a very real, very felt concern. We're asking the middle of our society to bear the cost for these wars. We're asking them to bear the brunt of these wars. And it simply isn't sustainable to try to do everything. And I think if something we've learned about the last 25 years of our foreign policies, it's really suffered from a lack of strategic focus. So China is the pacing threat. I think that's absolutely right. Russia also to an extent. And we're going to have to reorient our priorities around that. And I think it's what the American people want. I think the American people actually know this. And just to pick up on a point Richard said, do the American people care about strategic documents? I mean, no. But they do have a sense that China, for instance, is a very significant threat to us. I know that because this is what the people in my home state say. They say, well, wait a minute, we know that we're in strategic competition with China. China's been competing with us for jobs. Obviously, we're having major trade disputes with China. I mean, there's a real sense here that we are in a competition with China that is growing and intensifying, and we're going to have to do something about it.
I think that's right. I think the reason why you have, frankly, Republicans and Democrats cheering some of the president's actions on China is that folks have been wise to this for a long time. They've understood that other global actors have been cheating, and they've paid the price for that. And so whether or not, I agree with the specific way in which he's done it, I think, the American people are a little bit savvier than we may give them credit for. On the question of prioritization, I would just say this. I think we cannot effectively prioritize given the toolkit that the American president has to protect our interests globally today. What the great powers have learned is how to effectively move around American military hegemony and influence the global stage without ever having to directly confront the United States Navy, the United States Army, or Air Force. And yet we still are stuck in a world in which we are spending 20 times as much money on the military and the intelligence capabilities at our disposal than on those asymmetric capabilities. And so, if you really want to meet the great powers where they are, then you need to be meeting China on an economic playing field. You need to be meeting Russia on a corruption and disinformation playing field, on an energy independence playing field. And we simply have none of those capabilities. And it frankly dooms any president, no matter what their global philosophy is, no matter what their party is or their ideology, if they only have aircraft carriers and brigades to move around the global stage and not these other capacities that the other great powers have rightfully plussed up over the course of the last several decades.
I want to ask a little bit more about China to give Senator Hawley a chance to weigh on this as well. As you both are saying, there's a fair amount of consensus in Washington about that we are in an era of strategic competition with China, but everything after that gets pretty fuzzy. What are we competing over? What are the tactics of that competition? And what happens if we fail? So you've both recognized in prior statements, and Senator Murphy, you just said that this is not just a traditional security competition. There are a lot of other areas that we need to be putting more emphasis in. But what's in your mind specifically are those? What are the tactics of that competition, both to shape China's behavior, but also to advance American competitiveness?
Well, take technology, for instance. I mean, we are in a technological Cold War in many ways with China. And this is one of the reasons why I've introduced a bill that would place all of the Made in China 2025 initiative, their core technologies, I think there's 17 of them, it would place all of those core technologies on our export control list. Because I think we're finally, I hope, beginning to get to the point where we're realizing that China isn't just another market. And for our major technology companies in this country, like Google, for instance, that want to go and do business in China and have been willing, by the way, to compromise with the Chinese regime in terms of setting up search engines that censor the search results so that you never learn about Tiananmen Square, for instance. China's not just another market. If you do business in China and if you enter into their technology transfer agreements, you're doing business with the Chinese military. I mean, it is state-directed capitalism. And China has been very savvy about pursuing technological theft, about pursuing these technological transfer agreements as the price of doing business in the Chinese market. We're going to have to stand up to that. And we're going to have to realize, actually, to pick up on a point Chris just made about the need to have an economic policy, not just a narrowly focused military policy, but an economic policy that's alert and alive to the challenges of great power competition. Nowhere is this more needed than with China. And that means I think we're going to have to think about here at home, how do we develop our own industrial manufacturing and technological capacities? How do we strengthen middle class and working class wage earners so that they can effectively compete with labor abroad? And how do we stop China's rampant theft of intellectual property and their gaming of the international trade system?
Senator Murphy, I'm going to commit a sin here by asking you to retell a story you told before about a trip that you had to Dublin and China's efforts in Huawei there and how we are not resources against that.
So today Ireland has open a bid, a private sector bid, their telecoms company looking for a new 5G infrastructure. And of course, the Chinese are very interested in winning that bid. And when I was in Dublin, the embassy there noted that over the course of the prior few months, the Chinese embassy had exploded. It had grown 2 times as big as it was before, and the reason was China had deployed its national security infrastructure there on behalf of a private company to try to win this bid. And sitting around our table, as we were doing the briefing from the State Department and DOD, was one person charged to try to protect U.S. national security interests with respect to this Chinese technology bid in Dublin. We simply can't win when the Chinese double the size of their embassy, when we have only one person in our embassy who's fighting on that same playing field. And I think Josh is very right to say, ultimately, this is not just a question of whether we can kind of bully and push and prod our allies into not accepting that investment by the Chinese security state in their countries, but how do we make ourselves more competitive? How do we acknowledge that if the Chinese are underpricing everybody else, we have to have a strategy to deal with that. Bullying is only a short-term strategy to try to prevent the build out of their technology. And it's 5G today, but it's AI and a whole bunch of other leading edge technologies in the future. So we just have to take this much more seriously at a government level and then have this really difficult bipartisan conversation about what industrial policy looks like and how do you make Republicans, frankly, comfortable with an integration between the public and private sector that has typically been a difficult conversation.
I'm going to come back to a point that we were discussing in the first question on the AUMF, the authorization for use of military force. This is something that I've worked on for years, and I know a lot of folks in the audience feel quite personally that we've been operating in the United States under the same war authorization since 2001. And since then, it's drastically expanded geographically, but also to cover groups that were not in the original, and often expanding without the knowledge of the American public and even members of Congress. So, Senator Murphy, you've been a strong advocate for reasserting congressional authority in this area, and I know last year you suggested 3 changes, so correct me if I get this wrong. 1, a sunset clause, requiring Congress to authorize war against new groups, and geographic restriction, and that didn't succeed. So I'm curious, can you make, what is the case for these reforms, and what is your sense of why they are not getting more traction? And I think if you talk to members of Congress individually, they are quite often individually supportive.
Well, I was greatly worried about the Obama administration's decision to morph the 2001 AUMF to be able to cover ISIS. Not because I didn't desperately want to be engaged in the fight against ISIS, but that seemed to be a seemingly and potentially perpetual adaptation of an authorization that was not intended to cover this forever war that Richard was talking about. And so why I think it's useful to place either time or geographic limitations is that is one of the few things that may force a administration to come back to Congress to ask for an update. But the responsibility here is not just on Congress. We can, whip ourselves over our inability to pass authorizations of military force. But frankly, the first obligation is on the administration. The administration, both the Democratic and Republican administrations, often claim that part of the reason why they are not coming to Congress for authorization is because it's hard to get. Well, so what? There's a reason why authorizations are hard to get. As Josh said, the American public is deeply skeptical of broad military engagements overseas. And so I frankly applauded President Obama when he made the decision to not send missiles into Syria without coming to Congress. Whether or not that was a sign of political strength or weakness, I don't care. He had a constitutional obligation to get our permission first, and I frankly think that President Trump had the same obligation. So the first obligation is on the executive branch, and we need to make that clear. It doesn't excuse us, but just because it's hard for us to do it doesn't mean that the president can go ahead and do it without us.
Senator Hawley, I'll let you weigh in, and then we're going to turn to questions from the audience, of which I'll start with Iran. But go ahead if you want to add.
I think in some ways that the debates over the AMUF precede my time in Congress, but it strikes me as someone who's been here for only a few months that in some ways the debates over the AMUF and what exactly is covered and what isn't covered get back to this question about what is it exactly that we're trying to do with our foreign policy, and is there any real consensus on it? And I think what you're seeing is a pretty fundamental breakdown in consensus about what it is we're trying to do, particularly actually in the Middle East, in the CENTCOM theater, but even more broadly. And I think that these debates are reflective of that, and we're going to have to reach, I think, a new consensus. I mean, this is the urgent challenge of the moment, is to rebuild, hopefully a bipartisan consensus, but in any event, a workable foreign policy that will confront our major strategic challenges, including the continuing threat of violent extremist organizations, but will do so in a way that is sustainable and that actually reflects the priorities and needs of the American people. And Congress has a role to play in that.
All right, Iran, one of the topics of the week. So, Senator Hawley, you said during your campaign and have repeated since that you think that President Trump made the right decision to withdraw from the Iran deal. Senator Murphy, you disagree. You're one of the strongest supporters of the deal and one of the loudest critics of pulling out. But I think it's fair to say that you both agree on some broader goals. First of all, war with Iran, probably a bad idea. Second of all, that we want to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And third, that we want to, in some way, limit its malign activities in the region. So we are now, about a year from the U.S. pulling out of the JCPOA, a month after Iran announced plans to stop complying with some of the deal, a few weeks after the White House said that it's sending more troops to the region, and just now, a couple of days after attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf. This is one of those hard choices that Richard was mentioning. If you were both advising the president on what to do next, given where you stand on these issues, what's the right next couple of moves for the President of the United States, and what can Congress do to, I think, limit what seems to be a pretty tense situation going on in the Gulf right now?
I don't think I'm getting that job anytime soon.
I'll listen.
Well, I listen, in the short term, I think opening up lines of communication are most important. Yeah. I don't quite understand why we can talk to the North Korean regime and celebrate those discussions and yet not talk to the Iranians in the middle of what may be the precipice of a shooting war. So, obviously I have, and I'm happy to talk about the reasons why I think this president frittered away an opportunity to drill down on the next set of Iranian bad behavior. This president was set up with a Iranian regime that had, for the time being, forsaken its nuclear weapons program. We could have then rallied the international community to the next stage of pressure points on their ballistic missile program and their support for terrorist organizations. Instead, we decided to take a big step backwards, and now we are, essentially back in 2005 when we have an Iran which is potentially moving towards a nuclear weapon, and we're worried about Iranian attacks on U.S. troops. And we really have, I think, very little opportunity to deal outside of this crisis moment. But I think in the short run, there's a great potential for this to escalate out of control. And the most important thing we can probably do at some level is to open up lines of communication.
Well, I think that here we do have a disagreement. I think the idea that the withdrawal from our withdrawal from the joint agreement with Iran fundamentally changed the Iranian regime's either character or ambitions is I wish that were true. I wish we could influence them in that way, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think this is a malign regime that clearly has ambitions to exert significant control, at least over its region. And they are continuing to pursue those. And so I think if I were giving advice to the president, I would say to keep up the maximum pressure campaign. I think that's a good thing. We need to send a clear signal, I think, to Iran that if they do attack American soldiers, the American people in any form, American interests, that will be met with a swift and decisive response. On the other hand, I think we've got to keep our eye on the overall strategic picture. I do worry about the idea of troop buildup in the CENTCOM theater that is not directed towards any particular strategic purpose. I mean, we have the ability to strike against Iran, to do so very decisively, to do so in a way that is proportionate, without needing to pursue a large buildup that will be there for a long time, that frankly will take our eye off the ball of what we need to be doing in the Indo-Pacific or in the Baltics. So, we're going to have to walk and chew gum here, I think, but we need to send a clear message to Tehran. But we also need to maintain our larger strategic focus, and the NDS focus is the right focus to have, I think. We've got to keep our eye on that ball.
I'm going to come back to Iran in a minute, but I've got a lot of questions from the audience on Hong Kong and what's going on there. And so this one in particular comes from Perry Boyle, who's on the CNAS advisory board, and I'm going to augment it a bit with some others. Given that China is reintegrating Hong Kong against the will of its people, what should Congress do to signal, looking ahead, what should Congress think about doing to signal to Taiwan right now? Do you think that we should be signaling that we would come to the defense of Taiwan if China made similar moves against them in the future? And more broadly, in terms of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, is there anything that you would recommend that be changed or reformed in some way? I know that you've spoken a lot on this issue.
Yeah, I think that preventing a fait accompli in Taiwan with the Chinese attack on Taiwan has got to be a cornerstone of our strategic policy. The NDS makes it a cornerstone, and I think it's absolutely right. We should say that very publicly, that we are not going to acquiesce under any circumstance to a Chinese fait accompli of Taiwan and in Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we have to pursue military posture in the region that will make that very clear. And we need to work on continuing to build an alliance structure, including building new alliances with regional partners in the Indo-Pacific that will make sure that we can make good on that guarantee.
I would just add, I think a lot about what progressive foreign policy looks like moving forward. What's the role that Democrats and progressives can support for the U.S. military moving forward? And I would agree with Josh. One of the great successes of American foreign policy has been mutual defense security agreements, and they are a wise investment of resources. They come with high risk, obviously, when you commit yourselves to the defense of others, but by and large, they have been wildly successful in the post-war era. And I think, largely the American people understand the value of those partnerships. And so I would agree that as we look towards trying to confront Chinese aggression in their neighborhood, perhaps taking a look at the ability to build out U.S. security partnerships, sending a very clear message about what are the exact lines that China can cross that will require an American response is going to be an important part of our strategy in the region moving forward.
Okay, staying in Asia, we've got several questions on North Korea that I'll try to kludge together here. So the last two summits, well, the first one ostensibly made some progress between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. The second one, both leaders kind of felt was a failure in some way or did not make the progress that they expected. There is potential, I think, for a third summit at some time between the two leaders. To what degree, or let me rephrase a couple of these questions. How do you think the United States in particular should relook at how it's preparing for this summit? Are there different priorities that it should have going into it? Are there different kind of forms of negotiation that we should do? Or should we change our expectations overall in terms of North Korean denuclearization? Easy questions.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the North Carolinian leader just murdered all of his negotiators, so it's a little unclear who we're talking to, or
some of them are
or in
apparently
prison.
alive.
They disappeared. Some of them are
Right.
dead. Some of them are gone.
He only imprisons, so.
Right. So it's not exactly clear what the wisdom of a third summit is if there is no one to talk to in the lead up of that summit. The failure of the first summit was due to the fact that we didn't do the hard work ahead of time to try to create mutual understanding as to what the deliverables could be, and there was an immediate disconnect between the two leaders. Listen, I'm never an opponent of diplomacy or talks, even if those talks don't always lead to an outcome. But here is my worry. My worry is that the way in which the president wraps his arms around Kim Jong-un, the way in which he celebrates this brutal dictator, is having an effect outside the Korean Peninsula. It is giving a signal to other brutal autocrats and would-be brutal autocrats that they have safe cover as long as they entertain the president. And so this is not just about the Korean Peninsula any longer. This is about a broader message that's being sent in this global fight between our value system and others' value system. And if the North Koreans are simply using these talks as a means to build domestic legitimacy and continue to move forward their nuclear program, then I'm not sure why we'd be interested in that either, when we could be spending this time trying to build up a system of international sanctions, trying to convince the Chinese to get back into this game. Listen, I admit that I am sort of constantly caught in betwixt and between when it comes to how the Trump administration should deal with this brutal regime. I never mind talks. I just think that the broader message that the president's conduct towards Kim is sending has long-term ramifications for our security.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is that we don't have any good options in North Korea because North Korea is a nuclear power. And this is, I think, you could take almost everything Chris just said. If you take out North Korea, put in the word Iran, I would agree with all of it, most of it. So I think my great fear with the Iranian situation is that we would end up in Iran in the same posture that North Korea is now, where you really your options become much more limited when you're dealing with a power that has nuclear capabilities and is also, frankly, unstable. Having said that, I think that we need to continue to stay engaged with the North Koreans so long as we're pursuing the goal of denuclearization. I mean, I think we need to make that clear. I think talking for the sake of talking, it's not necessarily going to get us anywhere. But I think to get the North Koreans to commit, at least in principle, to denuclearization is a good thing. I think we should try and see if we can get more concessions along those lines. But we should also use this as an opportunity to be building those alliances in the region, not just as it relates to dealing with North Korea, but as it relates to dealing, again, with our longer-term challenge there, which is China. And so I think we should use this opportunity to be working with allies, to be talking about the panoply of security concerns there, but focusing, again, towards the medium, long-term, towards our really big challenge.
Got a couple of questions from the audience about the tech sector and disinformation. And Senator Hawley, I know you've been a pretty harsh critic of the technology sector. You had a speech, I think it was last month at the Hoover Institute, in which you had a term that I really liked called intention arbitrage as a business model, a concept that I found particularly concerning given the evidence that we've seen of foreign manipulation of social media and the degree to which current social media companies may be to some degree benefiting in some way from this manipulation. So my first question for you on this is, what more should the tech industry be doing to address the threat of foreign disinformation? And perhaps more importantly, should more regulation be on the table, and in what form?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, as it relates to the tech industry, they should be, and foreign interference, I mean, they should continue to work with DOD and all of the relevant agencies and channels of our government and the security apparatus to make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent foreign interference via the channels of social media in our elections, from whomever it comes, whether it's from Russia, whether it's from China, I don't care who it is. But I think there's a real, after the 2016 election, I think there's a real, there's a heightened awareness on the part, I hope, of the tech companies, certainly I can say within the government, that this is a form of interference that's real, that is concerted, that is coordinated, and that we need to be alive and alert to. But let me just say something broader about the tech companies. I am very disturbed by this trend that we have seen in Silicon Valley of tech companies being very happy to run and do business in China, to submit to China's many censorship demands. But then when it comes to helping develop AI technology that will make sure that we're not dropping bombs on innocent civilians, but actually targeting bad guys with the US military, Google and others say, oh, heaven's sakes, no, we just couldn't possibly. We have moral qualms. Well, I think this should be the good beginning of a good social debate. You have moral qualms about working with the United States Department of Defense, but you don't have moral qualms about partnering with a repressive Chinese regime that, as we speak, has, 1 million or more Uyghurs shut up in concentration camps, that is trying to brutally suppress its people, that has developed the most sophisticated authoritarian dictatorship in the history of the world? I mean, really? So I think it's time that we had that conversation and that Silicon Valley realized that they have a part to play in strengthening our own domestic economy, working where they can. Look, if they don't want to work with the Department of Defense, that's fine. It's a free country, that's fine. But I would ask them to think about what their technology partnerships with China really amount to. And I think I referenced earlier my effort at new export controls on those core technologies, those 17 plus core technologies of the Made in China 2025 initiative. I think we need to get serious about that and realize we are in a technological arms race.
So, Senator Murphy, on the other side of the coin, I think you were one of the key sponsors of the original Global Engagement Center legislation, but you've since raised a lot of concerns about whether or not the U.S. government is taking this seriously and even applying the resources that they have as against the threat of disinformation. So what would persuade you, what would be the key indicators that the U.S. government is actually taking on this challenge in a way that is commensurate with the actual threat?
Well, this started for me as an interest in combating Russian disinformation and influence in their periphery. And so the Global Engagement Center, which was conceived by Senator Portman and I in 2014, 2015, was about making sure that we were able to support objective third-party narratives, truth tellers, fact checkers in places like the Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, as Russia was pouring resources there. As we were writing that legislation, we weren't necessarily envisioning that the primary front was actually going to be here in the United States. I agree with Josh that we have to have a much more open conversation with our technology partners in this country about what they can continue to do to stand up defenses. But forgive me the aside, this week we do have to acknowledge that we took a fundamental step backwards in our campaign against disinformation. It's not clear how you can tell a technology company to forsake an investment from Russia or China in manipulating the U.S. election that might be to their benefit if the President of the United States has now announced that he will accept their help and their investment and tell no one about it. And so I think we are at a real crisis moment where members of Congress are trying to lead practically and morally to try to raise the specter of Russian interference in the next election. But the president has just signaled to everybody that if you receive a benefit from a foreign actor trying to influence an election, you have no obligation to do anything about it. And that message is being heard not just by people in the political milieu, but also commercial actors as well.
I want to move over quickly to a couple of economic questions. We had a few questions from Twitter reflecting the fact that we're talking a lot more about the economy on this stage than I think has happened in prior conferences, and that reflects a broader shift in how we're talking about American foreign policy these days. But one particular question that I thought was good is, are tariffs the appropriate tool for foreign policy disputes, whether or not they are trade related? In particular, this question says, are tariffs an appropriate tool for foreign policy disputes that are not trade related?
I would take it on a case by case basis. We have empowered the executive to use tariffs to deal with national security emergencies. And I think it probably is wise to give the president a panoply of tools with which to deal with true emergencies. The president today, I would argue, is using tariffs for non-emergency situations, but I don't necessarily think that our response should be to remove that authority. I think the broader danger, when you look at the way in which we are using American economic power abroad, whether it be tariffs or sanctions authority, is that all of this relies on the United States continuing to be the predominant standard setter of the global economy, the dollar being the world currency. And as we continue to be I would argue, overly reliant on sanctions and tariffs. It invites the world economy to look to a different standard, a different model, a different reserve currency. And I think we all have to be careful about that. But no, I wouldn't necessarily withdraw the authority. I just think the president may be using it in a way that is a little bit too creative.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Chris that I think that it's a case-by-case basis, but I think the short answer is yes. I mean, they can be. I mean, tariffs can be, I think, an appropriate response. But let me just use that to make a broader point, which I've now made it several different times, but I want to underscore because I think it's so important. And that is that I think there's been an easy assumption for many, many years now, decades now, that a system of greater international trade on whatever terms that trade might come, greater globalization of our economy, whatever that might look like in its specifics, is automatically good for the United States and it's automatically good for the American worker. That turns out, I think, to be a very problematic assumption. And that has opened up a gap between our foreign policy elites and many elites in our leadership class and the rank and file of the American people, many for whom globalization has not been, to put it mildly, an unmitigated blessing. We are going to have to strengthen and recommit to strengthening the great middle of our society who fight our wars, who pay our debts, who sustain this country if we're going to be able to sustain a robust foreign policy and continue to be a leader in the free world, the leader of the free world. And I think that challenge really, it's not just a domestic challenge, it's a foreign policy challenge, it's a whole of government challenge, it's the great challenge of our time.
And listen, I think the assumption was, as in Josh's opening remarks, were that China would take this journey with us. Right. And not only do they not take this journey with us, but they recognized that they could smartly ply upon American generosity and openness of markets in order to lap us economically. And again, Americans are wise to what they did, which is why many of them are supportive of the president's hard line. And so I think that this is exactly right, that we need to sort of wake up to the fundamental understanding of the American people that we haven't caught up to.
Got a lot of super national security nerd questions about the national security apparatus and whether or not the structures that were set up in 1947 and shortly thereafter are actually adequate to the task, in which you're speaking my language, but it's not often the language that gets a lot of people's real creative juices going. I mean, that said, Senator Murphy, you had a report out a couple of years ago on the need to reinvent how we perform foreign policy and shift a lot more resources over to the foreign affairs budget. So I hear a lot of leaders today quote Secretary Mattis to say that if you don't buy me more diplomats, I'm going to need you to buy more bullets. And they love that line, but we don't actually end up buying a lot more diplomats. So I'm curious, like, if you could, well, first of all, if there's one big reform that you could do, the national security apparatus, either of you, what would it be? And then second of all, why is it so hard to buy more diplomats? Like, what's the actual barrier here behind, both in the executive branch, but also in the legislative branch, to make that investment that I think a lot of people agree we need?
Yeah, listen, it's wild to think about today. The United States has more individuals working at military grocery stores than we have diplomats in the State Department. And I wouldn't resource diplomats just for the sake of buying and purchasing more. It's about what capabilities are we missing. So I identified one. We need far more American diplomats fighting the technology war abroad, making the case for why Chinese technology is ultimately just about letting the national security infrastructure through the front door. We should have a class of anti-corruption officers everywhere, right? Today, our political staffers in these agencies are dealing with domestic politics, corruption, graft, intimidation. We have to have a cadre of anti-corruption officers everywhere around the world. I don't know what capacity I would pick to put first, but I'll just give an advertisement for a bipartisan piece of legislation that has passed the House and is pending before the Foreign Relations Committee today, which is to add a big energy independence financing infrastructure to our toolkit. Right now, there are countries that are begging for help, especially in and around Russia's periphery, to make themselves independent of Russia, oil, and gas. And right now, all we can really offer them is advice. Senator Johnson, Senator Rubio, myself, and others have put forward a bill to create $1 billion financing mechanism by which we could actually put money on the table. And if you ask me, if you're going to spend $4 billion in Eastern Europe, is it better spent on a military investment for a sort of conventional Russian incursion across a NATO border that is unlikely to come? Or is it better spent on creating an investment plan to make all of those nations able to turn away from Russian petro resources? And I think that's a bipartisan breakthrough on a new capability that's possible this Congress.
You'd have my vote, but I sadly am not up there. Senator Hawley.
Just on the point about the national security apparatus and sort of thinning it and streamlining it, I think the National Defense Strategy asks the Joint Force, and in some ways the whole of government, but to make really tough choices about the capabilities that we need for the future, to make tough choices about of course, what our posture looks like. And I think that we need to, I think the current National Defense Authorization, the NDAA, it helps encourage those tough choices, but I think we need to continue to urge the services and DoD as a whole to conduct these very intensive reviews of whether it's weapons systems, whether it's troop levels, whether it's the 355-ship Navy. I mean, we need to be asking ourselves tough questions. Do we really need all of that? In order, do we need more stuff, or do we need more lethality? What is it we actually need to meet our strategic goals here? And I think we need to be laser focused on that. I think today's the birthday of the Army. Is that right? Happy birthday to the Army. And I just wanted to say that the Army, I really think, has been a real leader. If you look at what they've done in the last year, 2 years, a real leader in the NDS in thinking through top to bottom their acquisitions, thinking through their procurement, thinking through their force levels. And I really think we need more of that kind of holistic thinking, willing to make some pretty tough choices about what they're going to do, how they're going to operate in the future, but ones that are strategically minded, strategically focused.
All right, last question. We have miraculously not mentioned once the fact that there is a presidential election ongoing, which that feels like a relief from Twitter, where that's apparently the only thing happening. So, is there an issue that if you could put on the agenda of a debate on this presidential election in foreign policy, what would it be? Last question.
Well, listen, I mean, we have yet to talk about climate. This, to me, is the question that predates all the others. If you don't save our planet from existential crisis, then all of these other problems are unsolvable. And the droughts in Syria and Mali are a big part of the story as to why we have traditional security instability in those places. So this isn't a future conversation, it's a present conversation. And frankly, when you think about how you compete in a great power conflict, countries like China have figured out that there are millions of jobs to be had in renewable energy technology, and they've made an industrial policy decision to be the leaders in the development of wind turbines and solar panels. And so, not only is this about saving the planet from destruction, and I think it should be a topic for both parties in this presidential election, it also is part and parcel of a more traditional conversation about how you build power into that middle class that Josh is talking about, and how you recognize some of the industrial policy decisions that China and others have made, recognizing where these markets are going.
Yeah, I think for me the answer has to be China. I mean, what are we going to do? And again, because this will require a whole of government, whole of society approach. What are we going to do to not only see to our military strategic aims in the Indo-Pacific theater, but what are we going to do economically? I mean, what's our economic policy going to be towards China? What's our alliance policy going to be? How are we going to sustain what we need to do strategically, militarily there, and also what we need to do in the Baltics and elsewhere? And I think that we're beginning to recognize this as a problem. Talking about China has become something, de rigueur on Capitol Hill. That's good. That's a step forward. But we are a long way off, I think, yet from really seeing a coherent policy to deal with this great power competition that will range across a series of sectors. It's not just military, it's not just industrial, it's not just technological, it's all of the above. It's all of the above. And how do our NATO alliances, our legacy alliances fit into that? Those are really tough questions, but they are going to dominate in many ways, I think, the next 20, 30 years of our foreign and domestic policy.
So I think we've experienced a Washington miracle, a really in-depth, varied, sophisticated conversation between two senators of different parties where I heard them on foreign policy, where I heard them say, I agree more often than I disagree. So first of all, thank you both so much. This is incredible.